Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Elaine Garby. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Elliott School Alumni Programs and a Master's Alumna of the Elliott School as well. Thank you for joining us this evening for charting a course for a world in disarray, foreign policy and leadership insights from the Elliott School's deans. I myself have been at the Elliott School long enough to have worked with all of them in some capacity, and I'm very glad that we could have them all here with us tonight. International affairs as a field of study has existed at GW since 1898. The school we know today began in 1966 when it was established as the School of Public and International Affairs. In 1988, it was renamed the Elliott School of International Affairs in honor of retiring GW president Lloyd Elliott and his wife, Evelyn Betty Elliott. Since then, the Elliott School has grown into the largest school of international affairs in the United States, with over 2,000 undergraduate and 800 graduate students, and over 26,000 alumni worldwide. This is our featured Elliott School event celebrating GW's bicentennial this year, and is one of many programs happening across the university in recognition of this milestone achievement. All event details for GW's bicentennial celebration can be found online at bicentennial.gwu.edu. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Please note the questions are welcome at the end of the discussion, and our speakers will answer as many as time will allow. Simply submit your question into the Q&A box at any time during our discussion, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Please note that only the panelists and I will be able to see the submissions. The chat function has been disabled. We are now using closed captioning for all of our virtual events to promote accessibility for all of our audience members. You can turn on or hide the captions in your individual viewer with the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, an Elliott alumna from the class of 1980. Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley has had a groundbreaking career in service of the US government. A 30-year diplomat, she was the longest serving US ambassador to the Republic of Malta and has had senior positions at the Defense Department and the White House National Security Council. Currently, she serves as the co-chair and founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security, as well as vice chair of our very own International Women of Elliott Network. Gina, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Elaine. I am so pleased to be here to moderate the panel this evening. I'm excited to introduce our panelists today because this is going to be a particularly rich discussion. We'll be talking about our times, our schools, our place in the world itself. As a graduate of the Elliott School before it bore the name Elliott, I am thrilled to be here. So let's introduce the panelists whose collective tenure as deans of the Elliott School spanned from 1985 through the present. I'm so glad that we were able to welcome you all back here this evening. In chronological order, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Mickey East, Professor Emeritus of International Affairs and Political Science at GW. And Dr. East served as dean from 1985 to 1995. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Harry Harding, University Professor and Professor of Public Policy at the University of Virginia's Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. He's joining us from Taiwan. Dr. Harding served as dean from 1995 to 2005. Moving on to Dr. Michael Brown. He is a professor of international affairs and political science at the Elliott School, and Dr. Brown served as dean from 2005 to 2015. Next, please welcome my friend and colleague, Ambassador Ruben Brigitte, Vice Chancellor and President at the University of the South, Sewanee, a position he assumed this past year after serving as Elliott School Dean from 2015 until 2020. And finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Elliott School's current dean and the first permanent female dean, Dr. Alyssa Ayres. Dr. Ayres joined GW last month after serving as senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. We have a full house tonight, so we're going to jump right in. Each of our panelists will share thoughts on the challenges and opportunities in the foreign policy community, as well as the Elliott School's role in building leaders to tackle the most pressing global issues. So I'd like to give the first question to Dean Ayers. You assumed this role at nearly the 1-year mark of the pandemic, at the same time as the new administration entered office. Can you share with us what you see as the biggest immediate opportunity in foreign policy for the Biden administration?
Thank you, Gina. Let me just say before I answer this important question, how honored I am to follow all of the previous deans here, and what a pleasure it is to be able to take part in this conversation with you all tonight. So thanks to all of you for making the time for this. To answer your question, I have to say I've been so happy to see that the administration has moved very quickly in its Asia outreach. And that is precisely what I would have identified as the biggest immediate opportunity. They've done this actually in a way that I think addresses the changing dynamics in Asia. The Biden administration sees this region in a geographically expansive way. Some of our participants tonight might have noted that they've created within the National Security Council a new directorate, an Indo-Pacific directorate with an Indo-Pacific coordinator. This spans the entire region of East Asia, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Indian Ocean. It creates a bureaucratic structure that better situates India and the Indian Ocean as a part of this larger space. According to media reports, it also apparently now has a larger staff than the counterpart directorate covering the Middle East. So that also tells us something about priorities that the administration is placing on regions and where they're allocating time. As happened just a couple weeks ago, we saw the Biden administration decide not only to continue with the quadrilateral consultation that had been revived during the Trump administration. This is the diplomatic consultation that brings together Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. They not only decided to continue this, but they've elevated it. Secretary of State Blinken met with his counterparts from these three countries in mid-February, not even a full month into the new administration's time in office. And then just a couple of weeks ago, President Biden met virtually with these three countries' leaders. So that made this a summit level gathering for the first time. And frankly, with a real outcome, a partnership commitment to scale up vaccine production for distribution in Southeast Asia, which I think is a real demonstration of the power of these four countries combining capabilities on a question that is not military in nature, but is absolutely essential for security. So I would say that the administration has started out strong, seizing this opportunity in Asia, and I look forward to seeing how they'll take it further in the months ahead.
Thank you. I noticed that you used the word opportunity as well. So I'm going to flip the question just a little bit, and I'm going to flip to our very first dean, Dr. East. If you, from your vantage point, might speak about what you think the main opportunities are for the administration. And gentlemen, I'll be coming to the rest of you with either opportunity or challenge, so be thinking about that. Dr. East? Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to comment. However, I knew Harry Harding would be here, so I cut back a little on that end. And after listening to the president this afternoon, I probably shouldn't have done any preparation at all. But I did a little because the focus from what Alyssa said is something I want to at least bring to the fore. And that is that I think a major opportunity for the United States to move more quickly back into the global scene, and also to work on a problem that I think we'll all agree on as the highest priority. I think that we should increase our ability to help our US allies and friends, particularly in Europe, to together be able to craft a strategy to deal with China. China certainly needs their relations with the United States and with Europe. And so it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. and this needs to be done. We need to find specific areas that we can work with and try to tie us together in a way that we'll be in a better position to move forward, working with China on the problems that lie ahead of us. We certainly need to know more specific topics, and I think commenting just briefly on recent comments coming through is that the United States should be more of a not so US dominant, excuse me, because it seems to me we want to move from the America first. So the idea is not to move into the European to get them to do what we want, but to make a real honest effort to say, together we can do the best job of dealing with and managing our relations with Europe towards China.
Thank you. Dr. Harding, do you concur? Is China where we should be having our focus at this time? Please unmute.
That I think is going to be the message of the decade. Please unmute yourself. First of all, it's wonderful to be here. I so enjoyed my time at the Elliott School. I've had some wonderful jobs, but I think everyone on the panel knows, many in the audience know, that this is the one that I enjoyed the best, and it's because of the people. And I'm so glad to see my predecessors, my successor, Elaine. As soon as I heard her voice, I have to say it's about 7 in the morning here in Taiwan, and I was a little groggy waking up. But as soon as I saw Elaine's smiling face and heard her voice, I just felt, wow, I'm back home. So it's wonderful to be here. Now, in terms of kind of setting priorities, I find this kind of, in a way, easy to do in the abstract, but somehow often misleading, because a crisis or a great opportunity can reorder those priorities very quickly, push something to the top. But let me very quickly say, yes, first, in the short run, I think it is very important to stabilize the relationship with China. I'm disappointed that the meetings in Anchorage hopefully put a floor under the relationship, but they didn't really stabilize it in a more positive sense. It was a clearing of the air. So I was a little bit disappointed in that. I hope we might have found something that we could do that would indicate that we could move things forward. I think next on my agenda, obviously, would be dealing with the pandemic. We're making progress. I'm in Taiwan. I was telling people before everybody else got on, we are totally normal here. The death rate is extremely low for a population of 24, but we all take very good care, masking, hand sanitizing, temperature checks everywhere you go. The downside, we are on the bottom of everybody's priority list for getting vaccines. So we're all stuck here too. We don't get vaccines because we don't need vaccines, but then we're not going anywhere. So we've got to kind of continue spreading the vaccine program and making sure it's available as universally as is humanly possible. I think in the middle term, I think the great opportunity and challenge for Biden is to reinvigorate the American economy, give our people greater confidence in the benefits of globalization, and restore American, if you will, soft power. Our leadership potential so much has been damaged. And I'm a firm believer, along with Richard Haas, in the idea that foreign policy begins at home. And we've got a lot of homework to do. And then, of course, over the longer term, climate change is an absolutely vital and existential challenge, and maybe an opportunity to work with China. So I'm sorry I didn't give just one answer to your question, because I don't think there is one answer. There's many answers, and the Biden administration is going to have to be able to do several things at the same time.
Great, thank you. And in fact, you've segued or alighted very nicely into my thought processes as you were speaking, which is from my own professional background and some of the comments that you've made today, I think remind us all that the line between what are foreign policy issues and domestic policy issues is ephemeral at best. And so thinking as you talk about dealing with the pandemic and, not being able to travel from Taiwan, but that has impact on US business and relations and activity in the United States as well. Dr. Brown, if you could speak a little bit more about some of the issues that are muddying that line between foreign policy and domestic policy. Certainly, it's something that the new administration has taken note of, the fact that there's not a hard line there, that we all should be watching either as practitioners and those who are preparing to be practitioners. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And let me just echo what my colleagues have said. It's just wonderful to see everyone. And, the Elliott School is truly a very special community of people. And I think that's why we all value these connections so much. And I want to thank Elaine for, putting the band back together. This is the International Affairs edition of the Blues Brothers. And it's this particular band of international affairs specialists. I think, as everyone has been saying, there's a very strong link between domestic and foreign policy issues, and I think one of the great opportunities of the Biden administration is to strengthen U.S. hard power and soft power, and this is where domestic actions very much come into play. And with the US's leadership in developing and producing vaccines, I hope the US will very quickly be able to turn into a powerful exporter of vaccines. That will be of great value to people around the world. The US's economy, by all counts, is likely to be booming this year and into next year. And those two things will help the US in terms of its hard power position. And in terms of soft power, I think a lot of this will just simply flow naturally from President Biden and his administration. I mean, soft power depends on our values and policies and being admired and attractive around the world. And Biden, I think, will very quickly set not just a new tone, but a new direction compared to the past 4 years. And that's something that I think will help to strengthen ties with allies and friends around the world. That's going to be a priority for the administration. I think the good news is that Biden will provide reassurance to allies and friends just by being Joe Biden. I think a lot of that happened automatically on January 20th. I mean, for the past 4 years, allies around the world wondered if they were going to wake up and see a tweet saying that the US is pulling out of NATO or pulling US troops out of South Korea. And at least for the next 4 years, no one is going to be worried about that. And that's a good thing. I think the longer term challenge, though, for the Biden administration and the US is providing strategic reassurance has to be strategic and long term. And it'll be important for the president to engage on a lot of issues, not just the Paris Climate Change Accord, but the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which are going to be much trickier. But those kinds of engagements will be key to providing longer term strategic reassurance about the US's direction going forward, because everyone now knows that it's possible for someone like Donald Trump to be elected president of the United States, and it'll be up to Biden to convince folks that the U.S. really has resumed the position that it has had since 1945.
Okay. All right. You said a couple of things. So the question I had, Ambassador Brigety, is out the window because Dr. Brown has got me pivoting here. China and the importance of us being admired around the world was a point that Dr. Brown made. As we all know, in this last year, a lot has happened in America that has once again called into question how admired we are around the world. The hard look that we are taking at ourselves as Carl Rowan in particular, and US diplomats of all backgrounds faced in a really tough manner in the late 1950s and 1960s, when our domestic issues spilled out into international fora and the world was seeing us as we are. Ambassador Briggity, if you could speak a little bit about your views and with regard to our domestic position, where we are right now, and how best to navigate that internationally. For those who are going in international affairs, we have learned we have to answer the questions for everything that happens in the United States. And then I'm going to come to you, Dr. Ayers, with this one as well, because I often say, while racism is African Americans' burden, it is European Americans' problem. So this is not just a question for brown people to answer. Ambassador Briggity.
Sure. Well, Ambassador Abercrombie, Gina, and friends, it's wonderful to be back home virtually. I would like to henceforth be referred to as number 4 for the duration of this.
If you're a Star Trek fan, you are 4 of 5.
That's right. That's right. And it's great to be with you. I mean, so first of all, I'm in violent agreement with everything that everybody has said, not because we planned this in advance and not because we're so captured by a foreign policy elite, but because, reasonable people taking a look at where the United States has been over the last sort of half decade would reasonably come to very similar conclusions. And so without belaboring that, we're going to drill down on what you've asked me to drill down to, and that is the relationship between our domestic governance and our foreign policy position. And this is not simply a matter of winning a popularity contest. There are very real consequences to the extent to which how we are governing ourselves at home leaves others, both adversaries and allies, to believe that our foreign policy is stable, that it will be more or less consistent, even as presidential administrations change, that it enables us to be credible advocates for values that we say we believe in the rest of the world as it relates to democracy and human rights. And we have a material as well as a normative interest in spreading democratic practices and upholding human rights around the world. Because societies that do those things are better for our partnership, for our businesses, than societies that are repressive. And so, frankly, the world was shocked by the assault on our Capitol on January 6th. And that is not only a singular event, it was the apotheosis of years of profound political dysfunction and the continued fanning of the flames of misinformation and disunion. I'm going to shamelessly plug an article that I have that came out in the latest print edition of Foreign Affairs called "The Fractured Power: How to Overcome Tribalism at Home." Because having served in many other countries around the world that have been racked by sectarian divisions, societies, by the way, that are much more homogenous than ours, that have torn themselves apart. If you saw anywhere else in the world the trend lines that one sees in the United States now, as it relates to domestic violence, as it relates to undermining of democratic processes, as it relates to tension along ethnic and sectarian lines, we would be ringing the diplomatic alarm bells at the highest levels of government. And here's the thing. The price of being a free people is that nobody is coming to save us. There is no UN diplomatic or EU peace support mission is going to come in and help us sort out how we stop mass shootings in the United States, or to come in, it's going to figure out how do we actually live fully into the promise of having full ballot access for every American. Or how do we get our governing systems to work across tribal lines, the kinds of things that we have worked in Chad, in Somalia, in Kenya, in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia to try to get other countries to do.
Mhm.
And so for those of us who are engaged in foreign affairs, we have to do two things, three really. One is obviously do whatever we do in our particular orbits, if you're an Africanist or an arms control person or a China specialist or whatever. The second is, as you say, how do you explain this to foreign interlocutors? And the best thing about America is that we have proven repeatedly our ability to observe the gap between our professed values and our observable conduct and find ways to close that gap over time. And we are at yet another moment in our history where we have to do that, which leads us to the third point. All of us who are foreign affairs professionals have to also engage domestically. There are a lot of ways to do this. Whether that is obviously engaging in the domestic political processes for candidates that you support and holding our elected leaders accountable for figuring out ways to work through problems across lines, as opposed to staking out ideological positions that simply cannot be bridged, to finding ways in civic organizations of all kinds at very kind of local grassroots level to be able to get to know people that are different than us, so that we can find ways in a very interpersonal way to make up this deficit of trust. And by the way, this is not rocket science. This is what we are asking other countries around the world to do all the time. And we need to do more of it here in the United States.
Yeah, hear, hear. Dean Ayers, I'd like you to take up this question as well. Obviously, your perspective is going to be a little bit different, but again, this clash within our country that is being viewed by everyone, and of course, as we mentioned, the meeting with China and Alaska. I mean, this came up. So it is something that we're not going to be able to shy away from, and all thoughts on how best to address and carry forward are most welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Ruben, for, I mean, what's really a call for civic engagement, you know, kind of the power of American civic engagement. When we think about how to address our incommensurateness with our ideals at home and how to address this abroad, I think one of the things that is important, I mean, I've had the experience during my time at the State Department where some countries do not welcome our advice on the values set of issues. And frankly, this happens quite often, at least in my experience. And I've always believed that one of the ways we can be more persuasive on the values questions is by being very frank and open about our challenges at home. The past year has cast our domestic challenges onto a much broader stage, given the level of turmoil we've had in this country. But we have had a lot of domestic challenges for a long time. So there's an element of this conversation that isn't new. One of the things that I think is very helpful and that we ought to be able to point to and talk about, whether as diplomats or as individuals representing ourselves or our institutions abroad, is the fact that with our separation of powers, we do have very public conversations. We have oversight. Congress has hearings about challenges in the executive branch. We have a very open conversation often about the problems we face and different methods of trying to address them and where those have failed or not met the bar. Our media is open, which in and of itself is another testament to the power of media and democracy and to airing challenges and solutions and different points of view. So I've always been an advocate for putting those views on the table as diplomats or as US foreign policy professionals and saying, this is what we're dealing with in our own context. We think these values are important. We certainly have problems of our own. Here's how we're trying to address these. We would like to talk about this challenge in your context. How can we share experiences?
Okay, great. Thank you. Dr. Dean Harding, we heard the president's press conference today, but in addition to China, which we've spoken about a great deal this evening, and climate change, a couple of others, I wanted to make sure that we touched on Afghanistan in particular as a foreign policy challenge. And the general question was going to be, how much change should we expect in the Biden administration from the Trump administration? But looking at Afghanistan and the fact that it's 20 years, frankly, we've had a number of administrations try to grapple with this. We're supposed to be doing something about it this year. As you look at the landscape, as a former dean from George Washington University, advice council, did you like what you heard from the president today about what is coming next? You're muted.
In the spirit of candor, I'm going to have to admit to my professor colleagues that I come unprepared. The press conference was in the middle of the night here in Taiwan, so I didn't hear it.
Of course.
But let me try to.
Well, he said he hoped we'd be gone by the end of the year. In short,
the troops home before Christmas. We've heard that before. This is such a horribly knotty problem. I think in terms of the substantive issues, I think that Dean Ayers has the greatest experience of all of us in this part of the world. All I can say is that this is probably that and the intervention in Iraq, one of the greatest foreign policy failures in that we've still not been able to extricate ourselves and make better. I teach a course on leadership in American policy towards China. And one of the people that I will be discussing next week, someone who actually I got to know quite well, was Richard Holbrooke. And we may remember that Richard's last assignment was as the AFPAC coordinator. He basically was removed from that position because he got enmeshed in the domestic politics of Afghanistan, had very bad relations with the then president, that was a Washington favorite. And for those who may not remember, may not know the sad story, he basically that day died literally of a broken heart, a ruptured aorta. And supposedly his last words to the doctor were, fix Afghanistan. So this is a tragedy on so many levels, national, and of course national for Afghanistan itself. I have no words of wisdom, but let me kind of segue or pivot to another issue. As I hear my colleagues talk, what really has struck me is the wisdom of going back and looking at history. What really moved me profoundly was when it was said, and I frankly now forget who said it, many people reinforced it, that senior serving diplomats and senior retired diplomats have had this kind of experience before, especially in the 1960s, when we were also tearing ourselves apart and seemed enmeshed in a foreign policy failure. I would find it fascinating to know from their personal experiences how they dealt with those difficult problems of explaining the United States in the countries where they were posted. We could also do it comparatively. As I think, again, one of you said, there's no one who can come to help us. We have to help ourselves. So what would our advice be to other advanced economies and democratic political systems, high-income democracies? What would our advice be to others who are going through or have gone through these same problems? What would we say to them? What we say to ourselves? So I think kind of looking at it comparatively and historically might give some of the answers that unfortunately I'm not able to give at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor. I mean, the Middle East and Afghanistan in particular, as you said, Dean Harding, our foreign policy failures. I don't think anyone thinks we are where we should be or wanted to be in either region. And so I open the floor for others of you to comment or advise. And Dean Brown, Dean Ayers, Dean East, Dean Burgundy.
The thing that strikes me about Afghanistan is not so much the complexity of the problem, because it's incredibly complex. It's the changed nature of the leadership team on our end. Because if you recall, approach to Afghanistan was one of the few things that former Vice President Biden clearly and publicly broke with President Obama about. Mm-hmm. And President Biden, to refresh all of our memories, advocated a much more narrow counterterrorism strategy, as opposed to a broader counterinsurgency strategy, which is effectively what governed Afghanistan policy for the majority of President Obama's administration. And so where we are right now is with a president of the United States who frankly is now seeing the wreckage of Afghanistan as a result of his advice not being followed a decade or so ago. And as one who believes deeply in the great person theory of history, much less taken by more complex theories, I think it really comes down to who's the person in the room. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that because he knows that there is no good option, as Senator Jack Reed said, the definition of a bad policy is one that leaves you with no good options. I suspect what he and his team are evaluating now is where, amongst all the bad options, what is going to leave the United States in the strongest overall strategic position. And also, remember, this is a president who really deeply cares his heart on his sleeve, who lost his own son, not in combat, but understands that loss, and we'll be seeing this from that perspective. What's the strategy that's going to give it the best strategic advantage and also the most humane for America? And so I don't think you're going to see helicopters lifting off like our embassy in Kabul, a la Saigon in '73. Mm-hmm. But I do think you're going to see an exit, and you're going to see it sooner rather than later.
Dean Brown.
Yeah, let me pick up on an important observation Ruben just made. I mean, he talked about Biden and his team consulting on these issues, and to get to Harry's point about looking at things historically and comparatively, and administrations and foreign policy, what works and what doesn't. I mean, it takes a team. Even for someone like Joe Biden, who has been, immersed in foreign policy issues for many decades, his entire professional life in the Senate, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, even for someone like Joe Biden, who has exceptional experience and knowledge of foreign policy, it takes a team, it takes an administration. And one of the lessons of the last administration, just setting aside policies themselves, setting that aside, just the process was deeply broken because the president was a loose cannon and there was no team really building foreign policy on a wide range of key issues, from arms control, troop deployments in Syria and Afghanistan, and economic policy. Policy was all over the place. There was no consistency and no team to build and design and implement foreign policy. And I think Joe Biden understands that you have to work administration-wide, whole of government, to really design and implement a foreign policy, and that's what he's doing. Just to touch on one issue where I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping for a positive outcome, shifting from Afghanistan to Iran, I'm hoping the Biden administration will be able to put the Iran nuclear deal back on track. Right now, things are on hold, in part because Iran has an election coming up in June, also because the president is busy with 100 other things. But also the US and Iran have a first mover problem. No one wants to go first. Iran wants the US to ease up on sanctions. The US wants Iran to take a first step. This looks to me like a solvable problem. And some of the other parties to the agreement, maybe the EU, it should be easy to broker a framework where where the US and Iran both take a first step simultaneously, and to move things back toward compliance. And that's extremely important because we don't want a nuclear cascade in the Middle East. And we have other issues that we want to turn to as well. And I'm also hoping that China will continue to adhere to its, in my view, very wise minimal nuclear deterrent strategy. But if Iran starts building up, that maybe becomes more problematic. And so I'm hoping that this is an issue that at some point later in 2021 can be put back on track.
Great.
Can I just-
Could I just interrupt and say that I just want to underscore what Mike said about first mover problems. That's exactly the problem with China as well. And again, we need to look at past experience. How can we address that problem so that you can, instead of waiting for the other side to go first, find ways of negotiating ways of going forward together?
Mm-hmm. Dean Ayers?
I just wanted to add a quick note on Afghanistan, which I think everyone on our panel agrees is perhaps among the thorniest of current US foreign policy challenges. One of the reasons that it's even thornier is because there is an inherent women, peace, and security challenge in the choices that are being put before the United States on what we decide to do. And I think it's obvious to everyone that without peace and stability in Afghanistan, we will see a return to the kinds of severe violations of women's rights that were the case when the Taliban were in power. It is also the case that there is not political support in the United States for further continued deployments after 20 years. So I just hope that the women, peace, and security agenda doesn't get lost in all of these conversations. Is there a way to provide some level of security to protect the gains that have been made for women and children in Afghanistan over these years? I don't have a solution. I'm not sure we have an immediate solution for this question, but I just wanted to make sure we don't forget about it.
Yeah, no, that is it, isn't it? We know the challenges once we depart, what's going to happen, and either from the perspective of the people of Afghanistan or the perspective of the resources in human life and treasure that we have spent in Afghanistan. Yeah, so, okay. I have two closing questions I wanted to cover. One, I wanted you all to have the ability to talk a bit about the practice of training foreign policy practitioners, not just for the government, worthy though that is, but also for think tanks and non-governmental organizations, etc. The joy that which brought me to Washington and to George Washington was the ability to be part of solutions. I think that's why everybody's there. That training. So talk about either the practitioner of training people or what advice you might have for students themselves, for what they should be doing and adding to their quiver, what arrows they need to be adding to make them employable, as I speak as a parent for that, just that moment, employable, but also able to be part of solutions. We'll start with Dean East, I think. We'll start with Dean East and we'll go backwards to Dean Ayers, so she can get benefit of your thoughts as well. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, because that sends me into an area that I have thought about a little bit and takes me back to my early days as a dean of the school. It was around the time of 86, 87, 1986, 87. we were just getting our organization of the APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. Does it still exist? Is it
Yes,
the organization pulling people together?
absolutely.
The idea there was that a small grant we got it for APSIA to go and see whether we could find some ways to move ahead more quickly as we saw these changes coming place in the world. And we sent deans to different places. I went to Romania and Bulgaria. And on another trip, I ended up going to a number of states in Africa. And the question at the way is, how can we possibly increase the capacity of some of these people, not just the diplomacy, but it said before, people who are working in all sectors of life, but who we need to simply increase the international capacity to manage these global problems. And it was really shocking for me. For example, we went down into Romania's National Library and looked for economic texts.
Mhm.
Can you imagine the difficulties of trying to teach a course in economics in those days before the fall and immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union? And similarly, as we talked around, I did a lot of comparative foreign policy studies looking at various small nations. And a couple of the things that came out to me at the time just showed that help was needed here. For example, the largest single department in the Uganda Foreign Ministry in the late 70s and early 80s. Some of you can probably guess what it was. It was the department responsible for moving smoothly and quickly required goods into the parties of the diplomats in Uganda at the time. There were 7 young men working on that, and that was their department at the time. And how do you bring those people out? One just example again of that, not knowing how to move. Uganda had been invited at that time to come to an OAS meeting, and they had no idea of how to get their foreign minister, Wanumi Kabedi, into the country by filling out the appropriate forms and stuff at the time.
Okay.
And it almost kicked off a diplomatic row with Idi Amin at the time.
I
But
can imagine.
out of this, if I can just close up where we wanted to go, well, some of us were thinking about using the military training model. Now, there's a lot of negatives in there, including the first idea, but you've got to admit that there's tremendous amounts of military training across countries trying to build up this capacity. And the possibility of looking at that and today's APSIA members deciding how they best, as an organization and individually, can try to increase the capacity to manage this globe that we've got to deal with.
Got it. So starting with the basics, with capacity building, which is not a bad place to start. Dean Harding.
Yes, thank you. Well, I was following on Mickey as his successor, and that was a real crisis for us at the time because the Foreign Service exam had been canceled, and that traditional career path for our students was no longer open. We didn't know how long it would take for it to resume. But I think at that time, what was happening was 2 things. First of all, although the Foreign Service may have suspended hiring new employees, The rest of the society was discovering the importance of having skilled international affairs specialists to join their ranks. Businesses were seeing the need for international affairs specialists, the media, the think tanks in Washington, and so forth. But, and this gets back to a point that I think Ruben made, while academic theory and history are important as sort of background information, ways of analyzing the world, understanding the complexities, what was really necessary to add to the curriculum was skills. And one of the things that I enjoyed most was to go and meet with a number of our alumni in various positions around the United States, to some degree abroad as well, and to basically ask, what skills do you need? And we identified a kind of set of skills, the ability to analyze with insight, the ability to make decisions with wisdom. Subsequently, I learned another concept, which is foresight, the ability to anticipate what can go wrong and try to adopt and define policies that can reduce the probability of failure and increase the probability of success. The ability to advocate, the ability to lead in small groups, that adds enormously to the curriculum. So all of us as deans had to figure out, you can't teach everything. You don't have the resources and students don't have the time, but you do need to have this very complicated curriculum that will really prepare students, not just to understand, but to decide, to advocate, to act, to fix problems. It's a daunting task that both students and faculty face.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Dean Brown.
Well, one of the things that I think we all appreciate on this panel is that international affairs education has evolved dramatically over the decades, and all of us have spent a lot of time thinking about where we are and where we need to go in the future. I think as far as Elliott School students and alumni are concerned, I have sort of good news and bad news. I mean, the bad news is that the world it's always turbulent, but it's going to be especially turbulent in the decade ahead, in part because of the pandemic and the recession. It'll take at least a couple of years to recover from that, but also because of artificial intelligence, which is going to have multiple effects on societies, economies, and politics around the world. I mean, it's going to continue to be bouncy going forward. The good news is that Elliott School students and alumni are students of international affairs, and at the Elliott School in particular. And we're fortunate to all be at one of the best schools of international affairs on the planet. And as I'm sure everyone on this panel has said at one time or another, an international affairs education is really the best possible grounding for any student to have in the 21st century. It's multidisciplinary. It's the liberal arts education for a global world, which is the world we live in now. And so Elliott School students and alumni are in a great position to understand and deal with the challenges of the future. And if there's one thing that I think is going to be even more important in international affairs education in the years ahead, it's the importance of integrating and mainstreaming gender studies into international affairs. And we already do a lot of that at the Elliott School. Thanks in particular to Professor Barbara Miller and many of her colleagues, we launched a gender policy program that's now the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs, headed by Professor Shirley Graham. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that this is a set of issues that has to be broadly framed in terms of gender, not just women's rights, which has to be emphasized and prioritized, but we're all gendered people and we all have a stake in this. We all need to understand it. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of the pandemic and the recession is that, I mean, first of all, it has had disproportionate, devastating effects on women and girls around the world in terms of education and jobs and everything else. But the silver lining in all of this, and I'm desperately searching for a silver lining, but I think one silver lining is that there's more appreciation now of just how bad the effects of the pandemic and the recession have been on women and girls. There's more awareness of it, more appreciation of it. And I am hoping that not just in education, but in policy, this will get more attention. And I'm pleased to see that one of the things President Biden has done early on is establish a high-level gender policy council at the White House that was officially announced on International Women's Day a couple of weeks ago. But I think Joe Biden gets it, and we all have to get it. And I think the Elliott School is a place where we could really push this forward in the years ahead. And I know Alyssa has plenty of things to do, but I'm sure this is one of the things that she will want to think about.
Excellent. Thank you. Co-signed completely. Ambassador Brigady.
No, that's number 4.
Oh. Sorry. What? Yes. 4 or 5. Yes.
Exactly. So, I think, Gina, your question, I think, illustrates quite well, not simply the evolution of international affairs broadly, but the evolution of the Elliott School over time.
Mm-hmm.
So starting from the very beginning with Mickey's tenure, I think it was very clear that the development of international affairs, foreign affairs professionals required more than academic understanding of a discipline. And so that's sort of in the DNA of the school. And with Harry's introduction of skills courses, the first APSIA school to do so, and Mike's, in additional to the work he was doing on really building up our securities program, also leaning into the creation of what has now become our gender program. And then, the contribution that I think was made under my tenure was the introduction of ethics, specifically on the notion that there are any series of problems that require at a minimum an ethical analysis alongside kind of more traditional analyses, but then also almost by definition, if you're going to be training to engage in the world's hardest problems, there are going to be not easy ethical issues you're going to have to sort through. And helping people to set their ethical gyroscope early on in their tenure in their careers is actually a very important contribution to their toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what Dean Ayers is going to do on her watch. So I look forward to her contribution.
Absolutely. And Dean Ayers, you may close us out however you like.
So I'm 7 weeks into this terrific new job, which means I don't have big plans to announce at the moment, but I'm spending a lot of time listening and talking with colleagues to try to think through some of what I think we might once have seen as major foreign policy challenges in the years ahead and are now very much at our doorstep now. And I think the complexity of these kinds of challenges is a real issue for an international affairs education because it is a real issue for the practice of foreign policy. I would point to managing a global pandemic and global health issues, or the way that climate change, it's been on our foreign policy agenda, it's now on our doorstep. Cybersecurity, it has been on our foreign policy agenda at times in its own silo. This is now an immediate national security problem around the world. If we think about all these issues and the ways to try to address them, and you try to spin that out, you start realizing that solutions span so many different disciplines, right? And if you think about climate change, there's a technology piece with renewable energy, there's a finance piece, there's a multilateral negotiations piece, there's a piece of thinking about climate vulnerability and humanitarian response, refugees, migration. I mean, you can do that kind of mapping with any of these very complex challenges and quite quickly realize that providing an education about all of them means trying to find a way to span so many different kinds of issues and wrap them all in one. So I don't have an answer at the moment for how to appropriately address all these issues, but I do think it is the challenge of the next couple of years ahead in thinking about how we can bring an education about all these issues, not in silos, but in the kind of full scope that they now occupy on our foreign policy agenda.
Excellent. Excellent. My goodness. Thank you all for, as I knew it would be, such a rich discussion and a lot of food for thought. I know that my time is up for asking questions, so I'm going to silently applaud and turn it over to Elaine to pull questions from the audience. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. That was an excellent discussion, and we still have more to hear from our audience. So the first question is actually from a current graduate student, Sheena Salwan. This is directed to Dean Ayers first, but then of course others please chime in. Sheena is calling in from India, so she also says good morning. How do you see President Biden's strategic empathy being effective with nations such as Pakistan, where the leadership is not clear as to who leads, the civil government or the military? So, Alyssa?
Thank you, Sheena. Thanks for joining us from India. Nice to hear from you. That's a very good question. We'll have to see how this unfolds. I think what we have seen in the first instance is that the Biden administration is looking to maintain the close and growing partnership with India. That has been, in fact, a continuous foreign policy priority and one that has carried over from Democratic to Republican to Democratic to Republican to Democratic administrations. The relationship with Pakistan over the years has been up and down and up and down. It is in a moment of some tension at the moment. Pakistan itself is in a moment of great tension, but I think we'll also have to see how the conversation evolves around our engagement in Afghanistan, because our ties with Pakistan Pakistan has been an important part and an important complicating factor in our engagement in Afghanistan. And so we'll have to see how the Biden administration's review of our engagement there will unfold, and then how they then decide to proceed with Pakistan based on that decision.
Would anyone else care to comment? Okay. We will move on to the next question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Mentioned that Biden spoke during his press conference today and has put Vice President Harris in charge. The question, of course, has to do with immigration. The U.S. migrant tragedy at the southern border requires a whole of government approach and has a foreign policy dimension, of course. What foreign policy and national security tools should the administration bring to bear to address this problem?
Sure. Maybe I can take that one, since I spent a fair amount of my career on issues of refugees and migration. So the questioner is correct. It is a multi-dimensional problem that has, at a minimum, for purposes of discussion today, its origins in two very big issues. The first are unstable conditions throughout most of Central America that are driving people to seek a better life desperately, taking very desperate measures, in fact, to send children unaccompanied. I mean, what parent in the world would send a small child on an unaccompanied, perilous journey, if not for the view that even with those dangers, there is still a better option for a future than to stay where they are? And then the second problem is that our political dysfunction has made it impossible to date to have a rational immigration policy. And the thing is, it is not beyond comprehension in how you solve, or at least how you begin to address, both of those problem sets. starting with the latter, I mean, essentially what we need is a grand bargain that says we will secure the border in exchange for a guest worker program that is rational, easily accessible, or whatnot, and some level of amnesty for people that are here illegally that gives them an option towards legalization. And then with regard to the former problem, it's clear that we need to do for El Salvador, for Honduras, for Nicaragua, what we did in Colombia. And that is to figure out how to help stabilize those countries so that people have a better option for life where they are. So they won't take those sorts of things to risk to travel. And again, this, if I can just say, this goes back to the point that I made in the very earlier part that all of us have made in some form or fashion. Our inability to get past our own political divisions and to make our government functional is hurting us. And this is almost exhibit A of it. Because we know that broadly speaking, there is support in the majority of the American public for some form of a comprehensive immigration policy. But our politicians in Congress cannot deliver it over multiple administrations. And again, no one's coming to save us. We've got to figure this out on our own.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on that? I know it's a complicated and big issue. And Gina, feel free if you want to comment as well. Okay, we will move on to the next question is from an alumnus, Robert Winthrop. Regarding climate change, many would argue that almost 30 years of the UN climate change framework talks have resulted in many meetings and tragically small results, shaped by the dilemmas of collective action. Do you believe that the US should continue to emphasize the UN framework or emphasize regional, national, and transnational mitigation and adaptation efforts? Anyone?
I mean, I can take a bit of that. I would say part of the answer is all of the above. One of the surprising developments of the last 5-6 years has been, of course, the degree to which we've seen states, cities, companies, nonprofits step up to make their own voluntary commitments to reduce their emissions when the United States under the Trump administration pulled ourselves out of the Paris Agreement. So that was actually an interesting development that illustrated the extent to which you can see other units of analysis, not necessarily just the nation state, be willing to stand up and make a material difference, take steps of their own voluntarily on this question. I think the course of the last 2 years has really shown the world, I mean, with the kinds of extreme weather events that have unfolded, fires on our West Coast or in Australia, or, hurricanes, category 4, battering our Gulf Coast, our Northeast, cyclones, in the Bay of Bengal. I mean, we are seeing these events take place with a regularity that is stretching our insurance systems, it's stretching our finance, it's stretching our ability to be responsive. And so I think we've got to be doing all of the above. It's not only a multilateral negotiating process, it's thinking about where you can take those steps on your own and make a difference. It's thinking about the technology piece, how we can accelerate transformation into renewables, how we can move ourselves away from emissions. It's not just fossil fuel use, it's also things like concrete and buildings and thinking about green infrastructure. I mean, it's the whole gamut. So I meant for that to be a short answer and I went on a little bit too long, but I do think it has to be a kind of a whole of everything, all of the above approach.
Could I add a few words as well? I think that we've talked about some of the great dilemmas of trying to solve problems in a complicated world. The first mover problem, for example. And let me add another one, and that's the issue of relative gains. In a competitive world, even where everybody knows that they should cooperate to deal with urgent questions, unfortunately, still the question of relative gains will be for many as important as absolute gains. In other words, I know I need to cooperate, but who is going to pay more? Who's going to pay less? Who's going to get more? Who's going to get less? And basically, without going into details, I've heard of a very interesting social psychology experiment, of course, as they usually are with undergraduates in a social psych lab, where basically they tested the relative appeal of a relative gain outcome, where basically you do at least as well as you did before and better than others, versus absolute gains. You did really absolutely better. The only group of students who favored absolute gains, which logically you're supposed to do, were economics majors. Everybody else was interested in relative gains. How did I do relative to the others playing the game, the competitors, in other words? So this is another one of these huge problems which will plague so many issues. I hate to kind of be negative today, but that and the question of sort of general theory versus specific knowledge, the question of how do you solve the first mover problem, these are really big issues. And I think some, again, comparative and historical research might give us some insight as to how to deal with them.
Anyone else? Okay. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. What responsibility do you think wealthy nations have to support global access to COVID-19 vaccines and to support lower income countries economically during the pandemic?
I'm certain that I lost years off of my life helping to fight the 2014 Ebola crisis in West Africa. And one of the lessons that should have been learned by everybody from that crisis is that nobody is safe until everybody is. And that viruses that can create global pandemics don't know borders. And so, and in this particular case with the novel coronavirus that we're facing, we know that so long as it's circulating, it has the potential to mutate. And we know that future variants can be more, because the virus propagates, it learns essentially how to evade defenses, so it can be both more transmittable and potentially could also figure out how to evade the vaccines that have currently been brought to market. And so the only way to stop that is to get the world vaccinated as quickly as possible. So this is one of the situations where being altruistic is manifestly in our collective self-interests. And we need to be on this like yesterday, particularly when it is clear that we are going to have many more doses, certainly in the United States, than we're going to have people that need them already. And so I would hope that, the WHO just simply needs to organize a task force, and that is being supported by the rich countries of the world to figure out how to get, especially the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines out and distributed far and wide as quickly as possible.
Can I just chime in on that? I think one of the really interesting developments with the vaccine response is the fact that the world's largest vaccine manufacturer is the Serum Institute of India. This Serum Institute of India is a private company that took a big bet some months ago without knowing the outcome of the trials of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And they took a big bet ramping up production because they believed that vaccine was going to ultimately be viable. And so they would be in a position to ramp up production quickly. That turned out to be a correct bet. And they are now churning out the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine at much lower cost because they could do it at much lower cost in India. India itself is also providing shipments of vaccines to many countries around the world, particularly in the South Asia region and in Africa and in Latin America. Some of those are, in the form of donations. Some of them are paid, market payment. But I think what this also shows us, I referred at the beginning to the opportunity that I thought the Biden administration had to move quickly in Asia. And I spoke a little bit about the Quad summit that President Biden engaged with a couple weeks ago. Well, one of the outcomes of that Quad consultation, March 8th, was this agreement where Japan, Australia, the United States would support ramping up vaccine production in India. And then Japan and Australia would help with logistics of getting those vaccines shipped from India to Southeast Asia. So this is really starting to show how the power of working in concert with our allies and partners can deliver a better solution than if we're just working on our own.
Okay, seeing no other comments, we finally have two last questions that focus on your thoughts on the Elliott School's role in the future and advice you'd provide to students. So I'll ask that all of our panelists offer their thoughts if you feel comfortable. And then I'll ask first of all, and then we'll return to the second question. The first one comes from Jesse Altum, who is an alumnus. Where do you hope to see the Elliott School in 20 years, maybe 10, if you don't want to project that far out? And what is the role the institution is playing in international affairs in that future? Go ahead and jump in, anyone.
Sure, what the heck.
Go ahead.
I'd say a few things. So first of all, I would like for the Elliott School to continue to be on the forefront of shaping the state of the art of the discipline of foreign affairs. In particular, the intersection between theory and practice, which I think is from its very origins through the present day has been one of its lodestars. The world is only going to get smaller, and as Dean Ayers has said, increasingly complex, and helping to graduate students, young foreign affairs professionals who have not only the intellectual talent but the practical skill to be able to manage that complexity, I think is going to be one of the hallmarks of the Elliott School. And frankly, I think it's the potential to really help to continue to sharpen and define the field in that way.
I've got to be honest, this question is an important one. It requires a lot of careful thought. And it's exactly the kind of question that I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about. So I think, one of the things that was so appealing to me about the Elliott School is the fact that its mission really prioritizes being at the intersection, right? Excelling in educating students to be global leaders. The highest quality research on international affairs issues, being engaged in the public policy debate, right? All these components are what the school is about. So in 20 years, I would love to see the school being even better than it already is as a process of that continued growth, but it's already doing great work. So I would be happy to come back to all of you with some more specific thoughts on this question, but I do think that one of the unique aspects of the Elliott School is the fact that it is so engaged in all three components of foreign policy thought and practice and education, and being where it is such a great resource for anybody who is interested in foreign policy expertise.
Anyone else? We have one other question, so we can move on from the futurist hard questions here. So this last question, I think we have time for one more question. It's from a current student, Francesca Salazar, and it's also combined with an anonymous question because they're very similar. What words of wisdom would you share regarding diplomacy as we students progress in our education and into our careers? Further, what advice would you provide to current Elliott students or recent alumni considering careers in public service? And this one, we can have Gina, please feel free to jump in on the careers in public service.
Well, I'm
Or go ahead.
shy to start, but of course I am a huge proponent of this is a great time to be in public service. We have this unique moment. I was testifying in front of the House Appropriations Committee this morning about the issue of inclusion at the Department of State. It's a perennial issue that comes up. You've all read about it, I'm sure, in the last several months, but we're at a unique time where not only the department itself, but Congress and the administration and the American people all seem to be largely agreed about the need to level the playing field in a true fashion. And it's not just government looking at it, it's think tanks, it's non-governmental organizations, it's the private sector, it's across the board. So I believe we are at a particular time when everyone is going to get a chance to reach their full potential if they are interested in careers in foreign policy and in any of those spheres. I jokingly say for those interested in public service or government positions that the previous administration, as you know, the president bragged about it from time to time, left so many positions open that frankly, there are a lot of positions that need filling. This is a time when doing the right thing is easy to do because there's space for a whole lot of people. There's nothing better than public service, and there's nothing more interesting than foreign policy. So I think the combination of the two should make people excited to be at Elliott, and obviously the caliber of who's teaching you. Certainly I got a fabulous education, and it set me up very well for success. That nothing but excitement and good thoughts for the future. So that's my view.
Thank you so much. I mean, Ruben and Alyssa in particular, you've also had experience in the public service government sector, so please chime in if you'd like.
You know, let me start with the bad news and then build up to the good news. The last few years have been objectively devastating for the foreign affairs arms of the government of the United States of America. This is true. And to kind of reference an earlier question, anyone representing the United States over the course of a long career has always tried to figure out how they balance, you know, their own personal views against a policy with which they may disagree. But there was a serious exodus of talent at all levels, certainly at the State Department, and it's true in other parts of our foreign affairs establishment as well. Now, the reason that matters is that not only is this administration committed to rebuilding, I suspect it's true that hopefully it's true that other future Republican administrations, as Republican administrations in the past have done, will continue to value diplomacy as a key instrument of American power and recognize that you can't have diplomacy without really strong, capable diplomats. What that does mean is that as an individual, you have to, again, kind of do two things. One, you have to make sure your moral gyroscope is set in a way that you're comfortable. And you also need to understand what your own personal red lines are, which you'll develop over time. But I think are very important, because here's the thing: America needs a committed, professional, non-political diplomatic corps and professional, committed, non-political civil servants who will serve the government of the day equally. And it's as Ambassador Abraham Stanley said, it is a fantastic way to serve one's country. It's a fantastic sort of career path to take. And frankly, I think it's up to us kind of civilians to make sure it's a path that that one can sustain over the course of a lifetime by virtue of having governments over the course of many years that continue to stay within the boundaries of what the broad American public consider to be acceptable.
I would just add, I think that sometimes students are not always aware that there are a variety of different U.S. foreign services. And so as you think about a possible career in diplomacy and in our career diplomatic services, please keep in mind that we not only have the Foreign Service of the State Department, but the Foreign Commercial Service with the U.S. Department of Commerce engaged in commercial diplomacy around the world. We have the Foreign Service of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is focused on international development. We have the Foreign Agricultural Service, which is focused on agricultural market engagement around the world. These are smaller foreign services, but they do exist. And so it's worth remembering that there are different aspects to diplomacy. I would extend that further. You can be involved in foreign policy in the NGO world, in international organizations, in private businesses, many of which are global and many of which have foreign policy challenges of their own. So this is a big sea of opportunity. And I always advise young people to look broadly, find out the huge expanse of paths that you might be able to travel yourself, and then start asking questions and learning more about what might be the right fit for your interests.
We also have a somewhat larger Department of Defense and an almost equally massive intelligence community.
Yes, exactly. And you must have known that Professor Hope Harrison put into the Q&A that it's not just diplomacy, it covers a lot of things. So that was a perfect segue there, Dean Ayers and Mike, on this discussion. So we're going to wrap there. I just have a couple more comments to make, but thank you to Gina, Alyssa, Ruben, Mike, Harry, and Mickey. This was a wonderful and remarkable conversation, a great opportunity to bring you all back together. And we did receive several comments in the Q&A box, commenting as such, and I will share those with you later. Before we officially close, I just wanted to put a save the date out there for the next GW Alumni Association Signature Bicentennial event, which will be on April 15th. And we will be talking about GW's role and legacy in public service. So that also ties into what we're talking here a little bit. The event will feature Elliott alumna Senator Tammy Duckworth and GW alumni Nadja West, who is the former U.S. Surgeon General, and Rosalind Brock, Chairman Emeritus of the NAACP, Chairwoman Emeritus. And on April 28th, our next International Women of Elliott event will feature our very own alumna, Carol Spahn, who is Acting Director of the Peace Corps, and they are also celebrating their 60th anniversary this year. So stay tuned for more information on these and many other virtual events this spring. This concludes our program. Thank you so much, and please have a good evening or a good day, depending on where you're calling in from. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Elaine.
You're welcome. I do want to thank Mike for the title of the discussion too. He always comes up with great titles, so it's not mine alone.